Okay, welcome everyone. So I'm Andrew Sanders, I'm head of Warwick Law School, and it's a great pleasure, in fact a great honour, to be introducing this session. And I'd like to welcome our guests, Dexter Dias and Rob Berkeley, and also I'd like to welcome everyone from Essex and Kent Law Schools as well. I hope everyone can hear me. I won't say I hope everyone can see me, probably better if you don't look, but I hope everyone can hear me. So it's Black History Month, and this is our flagship event, and I know it's going to be really, really interesting. It happens to be a particular interest to me, not just because I head Warwick Law School, which is a great honour in itself, but also because my subject is criminal justice, and I was just talking to Dexter and Rob earlier about the fact that when I did the first edition of that book many years ago, what I think is one of the most interesting sections of it is on deaths in custody, where we draw attention to the fact that basically the police are licensed to use such power that huge numbers of people die in custody. It's not just in America, however much worse America may be, but in Britain and many other countries as well. These are things which shouldn't happen. We do need the police. We do need the police to have power, but we need them to be more accountable. But it's not only deaths in custody, many other aspects of power that gets abused. But it's not only defendants, it's also victims as well. Unfortunately, there is undoubtedly structural discrimination, again, not just in America, but in our country as well. And the Lammy report, which came out a couple of years ago, was a very, very good evidence of that. So this is a terrifically interesting topic, it's a terrifically important topic. It's a terrifically upsetting topic as well. We mustn't forget that we're actually talking about real people and real tragedies here. But that's enough from me. Let me hand over to Arjumand, who actually did the work of organising this.
Hi, everybody. Yes, thank you very much, Andrew. It wasn't just me. Actually, Celine, Dr. Celine Tan and Dr. Sharifa Sekalala, and also Dr. Carolina, and also Bejarano. We all worked together to organize this event in collaboration with the University of Essex Law School and also the Kent Law School. So on behalf of the Warwick Law School community, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. This is the first of a series of student talks on race and the law, a collaborative, as I said, a collaborative academic endeavor between the three law schools. We have two influential speakers to present on the subject today. Barrister Dexter Dias will share his thoughts on the way in which criminal justice system deals with defendants, and also particularly the Black defendants, as well as the minorities, other minorities as well. Dr. Rob Berkeley will then join us to respond to Dexter, and in doing so, will bring his invaluable insights on the topic. And at the end, I will open the floor for Q&A. I encourage the audience, especially our students from across all three law schools, to ask questions to either of our speakers and to also share their own thoughts by way of adding comments. But may I also remind our audience that during the presentations, we should all keep our microphones on mute, and also your camera switched off, if you don't mind, please. It's just to enable our speakers to speak freely in terms of the online the bandwidth of internet or whatever, something that might cause a trouble. So let me first briefly introduce our speaker, Barrister Dexter Dias. Dexter Dias is a well-known human rights lawyer. He has appeared in a number of high-profile cases, including inquests into deaths in custody and unlawful killings by the police. One of which is when he represented the family of Cherry Gross in a landmark inquest of national importance. Drawing on his experience, he will examine how race affects and infects the criminal justice system. So, Dexter, the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. How did this talk come about? It came about because I saw a Twitter exchange between Dr. Celine Tan at wonderful Warwick and Dr. Tara Van Hoe of Essex about race and criminal justice and academia. And I basically just jumped into that conversation pretty much without invitation. But lawyers are like that. But I think today is evidence that Twitter can do good things. Whether it outweighs the damage caused by getting the 45th president of the United States elected, of course, is another matter. But there isn't long now to find out what happens next week. I thought, rather than doing a formal presentation, what would be more interesting is if I shared a few thoughts with you. Thoughts that are pretty fluid, and they've changed quite a lot in the months since George Floyd was killed in Minnesota. But I'd like to put them out there for you to think about. They're kind of provocations, as Slavoj Žižek or Michel Foucault would say, and just really talking points for us to discuss further. But I want to discuss three things. Firstly, race. Secondly, racialized thinking. And thirdly, with those two building blocks, move on to race within the criminal justice system. And I suppose the first thing is to pose the critical question whether race is real at all. Because the pushback against Black Lives Matter is that race is not real, that it's mainly imagined or grossly exaggerated. I wonder, Sarah, would you play the first video for us just to get a sense of the kind of discourse and pushback? So Sarah's going to play the first video, and it's about a minute.
We're sick of this narrative, that's what's wrong. Yeah, the narrative of police brutality, the narrative of oppression, the narrative of racism, it's a lie. America's great. It's a lie. This is racism is what it is. That's what it is. There is no oppression. There is no racism. It's a leftist lie. It's a lie from the media, the liberal left.
Now, residents from Martinez got a permit from the city to paint the Black Lives Matter mural on July 4th. The mural painted at this incident and the area.
I think. So basically, most of what we're going to be discussing today is a leftist lie. But that's the United States. It's not like that in this country, is it? Some of you will know that in the aftermath of George Floyd's killing, there were all across the United Kingdom, there were Black Lives Matter solidarity protests and demonstrations. But there were counter demonstrations where alt-right and extremist groups, so-called statue defenders, went around statues in our city centres and were chanting, "I'm racist and I'm proud." There is, of course, a governmental inquiry. The government had to respond in some way to the Black Lives Matter movement, and so an inquiry was commissioned. But the Prime Minister has said that basically he wants to think about whether or not institutional racism may be more of a perception than a reality. And it's very interesting the way he puts it, that Johnson said he wants people of colour to get over themselves, to get over what he calls, quote, the sense of victimisation and discrimination, end quote. So you note how the people who are on the end of discriminatory practices are pathologised, they're gaslighted. This is, it seems to me, one of the great contests of our time. I was asked after George Floyd's death by TED to do a talk, which I did, on racism. As a result of that talk, I received what I can only describe as a barrage of racism and racial abuse. And some of it was pretty much like this. Sarah, I wonder whether you would put up the first photograph. Yeah, Sarah, I don't think that's quite the one. Right, so this is Manchester, and in the aftermath of George Floyd's death at the hands of the police, this person painted that on the side of what's like a bus shelter in Manchester. And then a couple of days after, this is what happened. Sarah, would you play the next, I'll put up the next photograph, please. And so the pushback, and we could take that down, please, Sarah. The pushback is very real. What happened to me was that in the TED Talk, I'd spoken about a particular case in which I'd represented a Black family in the Midlands. And I'll come to that case in a moment. But I want to say this. It wasn't the only case, or even the worst case, if it's ever possible to hierarchize these cases. But in that case, there was a young Black man called Alton who was in a prison cell. 7 prison officers came into the cell and dragged Alton out, and they held him in a horizontal crucifix position with 2 each on each leg, 1 on each arm, and then the 7th officer, who was the most senior, who was a deputy manager at the prison, held Alton's neck between his forearms in a vice-like clamp, and it ended up eventually with Alton asphyxiating to death. The comments that I received back after the TED Talk was that it was good that another Black criminal was dead. They also made comments about Alton's mother, who sat next to me during the inquest, that it was good that there was, because she died after the case, that there was one less Black person scrounging off benefits. The type of cases I've done over the last 30 years, and in the social justice campaigns I've been involved in, have included Cynthia Jarrett, a Black mother who died in highly contentious circumstances when the police raided her house. And Cynthia's death led to the Broadwater Farm riots. Roger Sylvester was a man in his 30s who died of brain damage and a heart attack when 6 police officers forcibly restrained him on the ground. And Roger was Black. Joy Gardner was a mature student who died of asphyxiation when officers from the alien deportation group, and think about the messaging in that label, restrained her and wrapped 13 feet of tape around her head. And Joy was Black. Christopher Alder was a 28-year-old man, a former paratrooper who was taken injured to a police station, and police officers stood around him and watched for 10 minutes, laughing as they watched him die. And Christopher was Black. Zayed Mubarak was an Asian youth who was put into a prison cell with a known psychopathic racist who got up in the middle of the night and clubbed Zayed to death with a table leg, and then drew a swastika on the wall with the rubber of his shoes. Gareth Meyer was a young child who was 15, who was restrained by prison officers. And Gareth, like George Floyd, was saying, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." And they restrained him until he died. And Gareth was someone of dual heritage. Sean Rigg was a black musician who died while being forcibly restrained by police officers in Brixton in a position they've known for years is potentially lethal. And Sean was black. Cherry Gross, as has been mentioned, was a woman who was shot in the back by a police officer in her home in front of her children. And that shooting led to the Brixton riots, and Cherry was black. How do we understand these events? The first point, I think, in order to build up to an analysis of the criminal justice system, is to think about what race is. Now, in social science, race is considered as a social construct, and most social scientists will agree with that it is, there is a consensus about it. But how has it been constructed? As a lawyer, I like evidence. And when you look at the evidence, what you realize is this, that we are, in fact, a relatively new species. Homo sapiens is only about 200,000 years old. And if you contrast it with, for example, crocodiles, 80 million years old, ants, 120 million years old, 600 times older than we are. So we are new kids on the block. And we came from a very small originating group in Africa. And it's for those reasons that the DNA that we share is incredibly extensive. We share 99.9% of our DNA with all other human beings. Now, what does that mean? It means that a Nordic blood in Scandinavia may have genetically common with someone from China or from India, as he has with someone from Wales. Thinking about that, why is race so salient? If you asked people about 1,000 years ago, they would have been mystified that skin colour itself presented the notion of inferiority of certain people. In fact, as some of you will know, the Romans had an emperor, Caracalla, in 211 CE, who was Libyan or Syrian and mixed with Berber. He certainly wasn't white, but that wasn't an issue because race was, in terms of skin colour, was not salient. So when did it become important? The thing to remember is it is an incredibly recent invention. It came about principally in its modern manifestation in the 1400s during the Spanish Inquisition, when Catholic powers on the Iberian Peninsula were trying to think about what to do about the rising Jewish power base in the country, and also what to do about the legacy of Muslim people who were in Spain still and were converting to Christianity. So they invented the notion of pure blood, and they said that these other people were inferior and stained. Of course, about the same time, there was the so-called misnomer of the Age of Discovery, where European adventurers went to the rest of the world and spread out east and west. East to countries like where I come from, the Indian subcontinent, and they had somehow to justify, how do you justify enslaving people, taking their land, their possessions, their women, their children, their resources, and in many cases, how do you justify the genocidal eradication of these peoples and still claim that you are highly religious Christians? The device that's used is race. You invent the notion that these people are not the same as us. They are not quite human in precisely the same way. Michel Foucault, speaks, of course, about this interesting flip. Francis Bacon has this idea of knowledge is power, the Baconian idea. Bacon, of course, was the first ever QC, legal advisor to Queen Elizabeth. But Bacon said, well, knowledge is power. Foucault, and this is the important thing to remember, flips that and says, but on another level, it's exactly the opposite as well, that not only is knowledge power, but power is knowledge. In other words, power constructs knowledge. It constructs what is legitimate knowledge and what counts as the truth. And of course, seen in this light, race doesn't exist as a scientific concept. It is the product of social power. And some of you will know a famous pronouncement of Baudelaire about the devil. Many of you will have heard it in the film, The Usual Suspects, where Kaiser Sose, Verbal says about Kaiser Sose, well, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled is convincing the world that he doesn't exist. But think about race. Race is something that doesn't exist as a scientific biological concept, and yet it is one of the most powerful shaping agents in the world. And that is an interesting inversion of what happened. We should understand it, and before I turn to deal with criminal justice, we should understand it, therefore, and my argument to you is that race is actually a technology. It is a technology of what? Of dehumanization. So it is not only a technology of classification, but also because all classifications and taxonomies imply a hierarchy. And so it's a technology of declassification. In other words, people at the lower end of the racial hierarchy are disqualified from equal species status. And as human rights lawyers, as I hope some of you will become, that is incredibly important to grasp in terms of the ramifications of what it has in terms of real world effects. So, thinking about racialized thinking, how does it operate? It operates both without and within. And the interesting thing about race is that also it is something, it's a lens we see the world through. And it has been embedded in us in a sense because our cognitive systems and our evaluative systems have been hacked by race. So much so that it's almost impossible for us to see the world in the absence of race. And I wonder, Sarah, whether you'd play the second video, please, just to give you an example of just how powerful this notion is. So, Sarah, would you play that, please?
In Brown versus Board of Education, the famous case that desegregated schools in the 1950s, Dr. Kenneth Clark conducted a doll test with black children. He asked them to choose between a black doll and a white doll. In instances, the majority of the children preferred the white doll. I decided to reconduct this test as Dr. Clark did to see how we've progressed since then. Can you show me the doll that you like best or that you'd like to play with?
This one. I like that one.
Okay.
This one.
That one?
This one. I like to play with this.
And can you show me the doll that is the nice doll? And why is that the nice doll?
He's white.
And can you show me the doll that looks bad? Okay. And can you and why does that look bad?
Because it's black.
And why do you think that's a nice doll?
Because she's white.
And can you give me the doll that looks like you? "15 out of the 21 children preferred the white doll."
Yes, thank you, Sarah. Ladies and gentlemen, I've seen that video maybe 150, 200 times, and every time I see it, it's called Black Doll, White Doll, if you want to look at it again. Actually, it's on the reading list that I hope we've posted for this talk. But if you want to see it again, look up Black Doll, White Doll on YouTube. So race operates in a very powerful way, both without and within. And if you want to think about what actually happens in the criminal justice system, which thirdly, I'm turning to, look at the way in which it operates in terms of what Pierre Bourdieu speaks about as the social field of the law. Andrew was right to mention the Lamy report, and that's also on the reading list, but just a few extracts from it. In this country, black women are twice as likely to be imprisoned for drugs offences as white women for drugs offences. Black children are 6 times more likely to be imprisoned. Black people are 7 times more likely to have the 50,000 volts of a taser fired into their body. And black people are 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched. But the stop and search is just the beginning of the process. There is huge racial disparity, not only in that, but in who's arrested, then who's prosecuted, who is taken to trial, who is sentenced to imprisonment, if they're sentenced to imprisonment, how long they're sentenced to imprisonment, and if they're released, how frequently and how readily they are recalled to prison. Now, why does that happen? Is it because of a bunch of individual racists at critical points in the criminal justice system? I gave a human rights talk at a prison, one of the biggest prisons in the country, and I remember that there was a black prison officer who came to speak to me as I was talking about diversity, and he took me into a side room before the talk with prison officers, and he said, "You're going to stir it up and make things worse." And I said, "Well, why?" And he said, the majority of people in this prison are black, the vast majority of prison officers are white, and there are prison officers who go to the wicket gate, that's the little window in the cell door, and show them the badge. And I said, "What do you mean, show them the badge?" And what these prison officers had under their lapels would be a badge belonging to a racist organisation. In those days, it was either the British National Party or the English Defence League. So there you've got individual racists within the prison system and the criminal justice system. So is it just, as Lord Scarman said in his analysis of the Brixton riots, just a question of a few bad apples? Bourdieu's protege and his successor, really, Loïc Vacon, who's professor at Berkeley, speaks about the dangers of such analysis. Vacon says, be careful about looking at the logic of the trial. In other words, not the trial in court, but the search for culprits, racist culprits at various points in the system. Because when you do that, you obfuscate and you are distracted from looking at the true identification of the mechanism of structural racism. And that's the mechanism for the production and reproduction of racialized outcomes. And if you start to just obsess about individuals, what you do is effectively let the system hook. And so the outcomes that David Lamy in his report identified are the product of this ongoing racialized system of justice, fed by racialized narratives at every point within it. People are affected in very direct ways with it, of course. But I just want to tell you about a couple of things. One of the people who reached out to me after the TED talk was a woman in a very prominent position in the criminal justice system who was Black and had suffered years of abuse. And what she said was that the truth is that the way it operates, and she's an incredibly courageous, intelligent woman who just never gave up despite all the racism she faced. But what she said happened is that she used to wear long sleeves because the impact of racism left the whole of her right arm just covered in markings and spots. So racism lands, and it has very real effects. It is, and I think we should view it as a form of social trauma. Trauma, why? Because it's a form of social pain, and perhaps we can talk about that in the discussion and come back to that. But so racism, real life effects, we were brought up, weren't we? Sticks and stones, etc. But words will never hurt me. They do. Words hurt, and they hurt because of the notion of social pain, which is very real. So all of this is a long run up to the wicket. If I can use a metaphor from an imperialist game that I love, because you can't take the child out of the empire completely, or the empire out of the child completely. And one of the things that I've been thinking about, and various universities and institutions, not only in this country, but around the world, have consulted with me or asked me to advise them about how to deracialize and how to decolonize the curriculum. What I would argue is that before we can even embark on that project, what we need to do is to decolonize our brains and our mind and our narratives. That is the essential first step. And you do that by firstly understanding what race is and what race isn't. Understand the myth of race, how it has been invented and produced as a form of social knowledge and control and power. Secondly, understand that deep paradoxical inversion that race actually doesn't exist, but the effects of it, racism, are real, and they affect people in their lives, and it is a form of social pain and trauma. And here's the interesting thing, the racialized narrative, that racism is real, and racism, that race is real. That's what the pushback against Black Lives Matter is. Race is real. There are real human races, and racism is imaginary. The truth is exactly the opposite. Race doesn't exist. It's not real. Racism, individual, but in particular institutional and structural, is real, and it has massive traumatizing effects on countless thousands of people. In that case, and I just want to end with this, in that case that I mentioned right at the outset, Alton's case, you could see, and this is the hope, I think, you could see how it is possible to strip away these racist narratives. At the beginning of the case, the all-white jury sent a note to the coroner saying, can we have more information about the criminal offending of this Black man? By the end of the case, and one of the interesting things about inquests is that it's a medieval jurisdiction, and so the jurors themselves are entitled to ask questions, and they have their own round of questioning. And by the end of the case, instead of me standing up and cross-examining prison officer number 25, prison officer number 30, the jury would put their hands up and say, Mr. Dias, can we go first? Which is highly unusual. But I said, yeah, go on. And they would be saying, how can you treat that lad like that? How could you have not tried to protect him? And so you saw by the process of the slow unveiling of the truth, you saw the humanization, you saw the deracialization, the elimination of these racial narratives, these default narratives, and they saw the suffering of another human being. At the end of the case, when the jury returned what was a historic verdict in that little cramped courtroom in the Midlands, that Alton had been unlawfully killed by these prison officers. Alton's sister, who was sitting next to me on my left, stood up and stood in the aisle of the courtroom and pointed at the prison officers and shouted repeatedly at them, "You killed my brother, you killed my brother." And it was just white noise in court. It was just electric what was happening. And I turned to my left to Alton's mum, who'd been sitting next to me all through the case. And I said to her, "Mrs. Manning, I'm sorry for your family." And she turned to me and she said, "Mr. Dias, you are family." And she pointed to the prison officers at the front of the court and she said, "And they are family." And she pointed to the juror and the jury and she said, "And they are family." But families bicker, but somehow we have to sort it out. And that is why I think events like today are so, so critical. And I'm really grateful to everybody who has put in so much hard work to make it happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dexter. It's been a really insightful presentation. I'm sure there will be questions in the audience, but we can take those questions after our next presentation. So Dr. Rob Berkeley is a self-claimed recovering academic, if academics can ever recover. So I wish him all the best. He is also a social reformer currently developing blackoutuk.com, a community-owned media asset and collaborative leadership network for and by Black queer men. He was the director of the racial justice think tank Runnymede Trust, 2009 and from 2009 to 14. That's when I got to know him, when I was working for an NGO in London. Alongside his academic writing on education, social justice, and community organizing, he's been recently appointed Simon Industrial Fellow at the University of Manchester. He has also produced documentaries and lectured across the UK and beyond. Dr. Berkeley was awarded an MBE in 2015 for his services to equality. So Rob will reflect on Dexter's talk, and in doing so, he'll bring in his own insights on racism in British legal system. Rob, you have 10 minutes. I know it's a tall order, but we have limited time, and we wanted to allow enough time for our Q&A session. So please.
It's a great pleasure to be here, and thanks a lot, Dexter, for your talk. And I was reflecting while you were speaking about that conundrum, that conundrum between race not existing, there being more variation within so-called races than there is between them, and the very real lived experience of racism. So thanks for the provocation. I think I'll provoke back, right? Why not? Because you started off saying, to think about what race is, and actually I think it may be useful to think alongside that about what the law is in a similar manner. So the law is a means of social control, and so is race. And in some ways, I think we exceptionalize race, but we have other constructs that are as powerful but as imagined. Take money, for example, or the law, or the nation, or even inheritance. Right. So even some sort of sense that there's a relationship between now and 100 years ago, is something which is socially created, right? Because his history and those stories are socially created. So the suggestion, and I think that's the thing that you point to towards the end, that notion that that the racist would like to reassert race as a biological, as something biological and real, and racism as something which is imagined and therefore ethereal, doesn't really hold. I mean, it's another reason why the racist is wrong, right? Because they would suggest that because it's imagined, it's not powerful, and I think that is a mistake that we make too often. But I wanted to explore a little bit further that notion then, that there might be some solutions in somehow overcoming race, or not recognizing that those stories, those histories are important, that those inheritances are significant, that race has become a useful form of identification for many people, in a world in which identities and solidarities are created and sustained in ways which give people a sense of self. So there's potentially a fear in that narrative about becoming post-racial, that we'll also lose something in terms of those histories and those stories that we identify ourselves with. And so the problem shouldn't be located in the fact that there are differences. The problem should be located in the fact that we use those differences to oppress. And then I started when you were referring to how deeply embedded the structures of race have become in our society. Thinking back to my A-level history course, and Jack Scarisbrick, a famous Warwick professor who wrote so much about the Tudors, but failed in his work to write about much about Jack Hawkins and the first slave trader, and that process of othering people enough to make money out of them, so they could settle a new world. And Elizabeth I is remembered for a lot of things, but not really in the popular discourse, at least, for enabling slave trading. And that forgetfulness goes back to Elizabeth I, but also right up to more recently in terms of empire. So it's kind of so it is a kind of pattern. You have a national story which doesn't talk explicitly necessarily about race, but is very much about perpetuating a particular racist line. I then thought about my relationship with the legal system. I wanted to get kind of back to that. And you talked a lot about deaths in custody, and your experience with those cases, I think, is it's just amazing. I spent a lot of time speaking about stop and search. That's my particular cross there, I think. And I saw the new figures come out this week, and still seeing the somersaults which in which the police and politicians will put themselves through to maintain this power to stop and search with reasonable suspicion or unreasonable suspicion, depending on particular part of law which they're using. But it delivered 9.5 times disproportionality between black and white across the country. And then you would see people who would have quite sane conversations about enforcement and protection from crime, throw all logic out the window to say, well, we made, I think it was something like 18,000 stops and 750 arrests from those stops under Section 60. Please, can we maintain that power? When you think of a success rate of 4%, well, I think the students would fail if they came up with a 4% response. And so there's something else going on there. So how can we expose and name what's going on more coherently? Because otherwise, I think the expectation is that we'll be seeking to kind of boil the sea when actually there's some really precise things going on. This it feels like about a process of social control, and young black men are seen as being out of control, and therefore stopping and searching them is functionally a useful thing to do, and that people accept those massive disproportionalities because they think that young black men are 9.5 times more disruptive to society than white young men, and I think that can become hard-boiled within a relationship between the state and the citizen, and it's unsurprising then that there aren't numerous young black men wanting to become policemen, or wanting to or feeling encouraged to go to the police for protection. So it becomes a kind of self-perpetuating pattern, and I think those who will watch the story of Leroy Logan that John Berg has been playing on BBC will see somebody who did become a policeman and left as frustrated kind of 30 years later in their career. There's so much to talk about, particularly around then this notion of decolonization, which I think is fascinating. Though I wonder whether it will bear the kind of fruit that people expect for it, partly because it seems so abstract. Particularly when, as a gay man, I'm conscious I grew up under Section 28 of the Local Government Act, where the Soviet government suggested that schools shouldn't talk about what they call pretended families, and shouldn't talk about homosexual relationships to children, and it had a really kind of a really terrible effect on the education system and on numerous people who felt like their existence was being denied. Last week we had a government minister suggest that schools that talked about critical race theory should similarly would also be breaking the law. Another chilling effect on that discussion about a solution to addressing this kind of ingrained pattern of racism. The scary or the notable thing, I think, is that it was a black minister who chose to make that statement, which highlights, I guess, for me, quite how complex and complicated this this arena is. And I think you're wise to remind us that it's about people and people's lives, and can be quite triggering and difficult conversations to have. I think after 5 years leading Runnymede, I avowedly decided not to talk about race for a little while. And in fact, if you read the Rennie's book, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, she was interning for Runnymede at the time. So so I think she has had a sense of quite how exhausting it can be. So I'd be interested in thinking about how we not just recognise trauma, but move towards a conversation around healing, and similarly put race on a par with some of our other big social constructs, rather than seeing it as something quite so exceptional. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Rob, for your reflection. What I like to do now is to open the floor for Q&A. If I may ask all our audience to raise your electronic hands so I can take their questions in order. We have plenty of time, so you can all come in. And also, if you don't have a question, you can always comment and share your thoughts on the subject. And please, while asking a question, if I may request you, if you could, to please switch your camera on so the speakers can also see you. Yeah. Does anybody have any question? So I might, Vanessa has got a question. Vanessa, would you like to?
Yeah. Hi there. I just wanted to say thank you for this talk. It was really, really wonderful, and it was so nice hearing everybody's arguments and stuff. I wanted to ask a question to Dexter. So, in light of your experiences and exposure of the realities of race relations, specifically in the UK, just hearing it just made me feel really angry and sad as a Black woman. But I wanted to know, how do you keep hopeful and not kind of lose hope in humanity? But yeah, that's just my question for you.
Thank you, Vanessa. You know what? It is actually the question I'm probably asked first more than anything, apart from what's it like wearing a wig and gown all day at work. That's kind of number one. Number two, Vanessa, is exactly that, because I hope it comes across. I'm actually quite a positive, optimistic guy. And, I wrote this book called The 10 Types of Human, which deals with, part of, as well as race. I do a lot of work about violence against women and children in particular, help change the law on FGM, domestic abuse, modern slavery, child soldiering. People say, how on earth do you cope with all of that? And the thing about it, and I've found again and again, I work on 4 continents, is just the individual people who are going to change things and make a difference. So, for example, to give one example, think about the Alton Manning case. In Alton Manning, you had an all-white jury who at the beginning didn't give a monkeys about what was happening, and they just wanted to know about the Black person, the Black criminal. They wanted to know about his criminal record. But what happened was we were able to reset that default racialized narrative and to actually let them see the human being behind it. And that's what happens. I see that happening again and again and again. And it takes work, but it is something that is achievable. And it goes back, I think, just to come back to one of the brilliant points that Rob was making about the question of healing. Rob's right. How do we move to solutions that are going to be healing? And I think, Rob, healing on an individual basis and on a societal basis. I think, obviously, you're thinking about both those things. the number one step, if you were to ask a medic, I'm not talking about an anti-vaxxer kind of medic. I mean a real, not a Trump-like medic, but who injecting detergent in the veins. A real medic. If you're asking a real medic, they'll say the first thing you need is a diagnosis. What is the diagnosis for race and racialized justice and institutional racism? What I'm trying to say to all of you who are lawyers who want to be legal professionals or want to work in human rights, in terms of race, my view, and I got into real trouble about this on another talk with other people, said, well, because my view is it's our duty. And they say, well, it's not our, as Rob was saying about the wonderful author of that book, who's saying, I don't want to talk to white people about race anymore. It's not our duty to educate white people. It is our duty to try to fight for the next generation of people who are going to be subject to that. And I got that because I started off my legal career representing anti-apartheid activists. Now, most of you, I imagine, who are in this talk today weren't even born when Nelson Mandela was freed. I went to the bar principally to be part of the anti-apartheid movement. And what they taught me is, listen, you have to diagnose the system first. It's no point, there's no point in trying to object to something if you do not understand what it is you're actually objecting to. So I think we need to have a clear understanding of what race is. How many people in this talk, I wonder, actually knew that race doesn't exist as a scientific and a biological concept? We were never taught, I was never taught that. My daughters have not been taught that at school. Why not? Think about why not. So we need to understand what race is. We need to understand racialized thinking. And that video, I don't know whether Vanessa, you've seen that video before, Black Doll, White Doll. It is, to me, a shocking, shocking thing. But it shows us just how powerful this mechanism is. And it's powerful, and it goes to another point that Rob was making, that yes, we've got a black minister, a black senior politician, saying that we should think about whether having or teaching critical race theory should be unlawful. What does that tell us? You know what? That tells us that we're doing something right. It tells us that we're actually on the right track, because privilege and power will never give itself up readily. Never. Apartheid, a movement and a struggle. Civil rights in the United States took a movement and a struggle, and therefore, and I'm going to round off now, but think about this. It's no good. It is no good just having a Black Lives Matter moment. What Angela Davis, who was a black rights protester in the 60s and 70s, was on the FBI's most wanted list, who they were trying to get the life sentence or a death sentence for her, and who was acquitted. Now professor at University of California, Santa Cruz, Angela Davis says, you don't need a moment, you need a movement. So the question is, what is the movement? And that's what I think we need to think about.
Okay, thank you very much. Chidera, you have a question?
So, thank you. I really liked your speech, by the way. I really liked your speech. I was wondering, so in regards to taking down the system, like, how do you feasibly do that? Like, is it a case of having more Black people within the legal system? Or is it a case of just campaigning? Or is it, because like, obviously, as you quite rightly said, like, what you need is a movement, not a moment. And so like to have a sustained movement, like surely doesn't that entail like having more black people within the system?
Mm-hmm.
But then again, though, black people are not like a numerical majority in this country. So like, how do you get more? How do you basically increase the representation and making sure those people have the right agenda to actually change the system?
Okay, Rob, is there anything you want to say about that?
Yeah, just briefly, I think reflecting on South Africa, actually, Desmond Tutu would say there's only one way to eat an elephant, and that's a piece at a time. So there's plenty of the system to tackle. So it's great to have a strategy, but actually tackle it. Secondly, I would say that it won't be from one direction. So it will need to be some people outside the system, some people inside the system. And I currently work with a group of men trying to create an alternative to existing systems to give people a sense of where they could go. I think that's important, as important as it is to work on the system internally. But Dexter.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Sorry, is your name Amika?
Chidera.
Okay, thank you very much for your question. It's a really important question. I think that we need to have more representation within the system. I'm a member of a set of barristers' chambers, and for years we didn't have a strict rule about it, but people didn't, for example, apply to be judges. I think that the critical thinking on the left has changed over the last 2 or 3 decades, because the idea at that point was if you become part of the establishment, you're going to get compromised, you won't be able to do anything. But I think the more modern approach is that, as Rob says, you need to have people inside and outside, because how are you going to just change a system exclusively from the outside? And let me just give you one example. I was sitting as a judge in South London in this case where the police had arrested a young black man, very well dressed, had a very expensive car, because he's doing very well in business, that was flourishing. But the police, obviously, can you imagine a young black man in a car like that, in a suit like that, in South London, going to get pulled. And he was convicted by the magistrates at a lower court, and he appealed the conviction, and he was convicted of using his mobile phone. And he said, I wasn't at all. But the police, he said, had to invent some spurious reason for pulling me. When it came to the case in front of me, it became absolutely obvious to me that the police officer who gave evidence against him was not telling the truth. And so went out. As a judge, you sit with 2 lay magistrates. So I was sitting with 2 white magistrates, and eventually we came back and we upheld his appeal. But as the judge, I was the person who had to announce the decision, the verdict of the court. And so I said to him, would you stand up, please? And I said, well, we are going to allow your appeal. And he said to me, I need time to pay the fine. And I said, no, we've allowed your appeal. There's no fine to pay. That's it. And he said, I've just started a new job. I need time to pay the fine. I can't pay it straight away. And it took me 3 times before he actually heard what I was saying to him, because he was so expecting that outcome. And when I said, look, pause, you've won, he did something that I will never forget. And what he did was, this incredibly confident person, he just burst into tears in public. And I said to him, why, if you don't mind me asking, what's the matter? And he said, Judge, do you know what we call your court in this community? And I said, no, but tell me. And he said, we call these courts police support. Now, think about the nature of the damage to society that is having, that people do not think that the courts are going to give them justice. And so I think, to go back to your question, I think it's important that we, as they say, flood the zone, that we do have people at every level, because you can make a change, you can make a difference, certainly to people's lives on a small scale. That's one thing that I think is really important, but I don't think it's enough. And I agree with Rob that we need to have interventions outside the system as well.
Thank you very much, Rob. Shidara, is that okay? You want to follow up, or is that enough?
I'm satisfied, yeah.
May I
Amika,
interventions outside of the system? Sorry, just a follow-up question.
okay. Sorry, can you come back again?
Oh, I was asking a follow-up question. What do you mean by more interventions outside of the system? Would you elaborate, please? Examples. Yeah.
Rob, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I can do. Let's think of a good one. Cooperative housing, or models which seek to defund the police. That's an interesting kind of idea that's arisen out of Black Lives Matter in the States, and was instantly dismissed in the UK, simply because that's not a problem that we would have here. Until somebody points out that, okay, that's the police are asking you for more money, but they've just wasted 20,000 hours of staff time stopping and searching young Black youth. So if they had less money, maybe they will do it less. So I think there's a kind of conversation that you can have from outside the system, which you can't or wouldn't necessarily have insights from within the system if you're thinking about how to make that system work better. I'm not suggesting. I'm not suggesting in the UK currently acts of terror. I think that's kind of the extreme. But I think there are alternative ways of framing the world, and the systems don't necessarily deliver that straight away.
Okay, thank you. Can I give you another example? Another example is what we're doing today. Actually, I think it needs a collage approach. It needs a sort of jigsaw approach. In order to affect meaningful change, there are all sorts of little pieces of the social jigsaw that need to be put into place. But, and going back to one of the points that Rob quite rightly raised in his response a bit earlier, about, for example, the whole decolonization question. Rob is right to ask, or to raise the critical question that we should be asking: how effective is it? How effective could it be? Now, it seems to me that that goes back to the question of our conceptualization. What theory do we have of human behavior and social change? And so we need to have a clear answer to that. One of the concerns I have about the I'm not going to talk anymore to white people about race, is what is the theory of change if you do not engage? How is it going to change? Do you think that there are good examples historically of privilege that has just given itself up, of power that has divested itself of power? And I think that what's important, what I learned from anti-apartheid activists, is that they forged really creative alliances with other groups, with other dissenting voices, whether they were white or communist or people abroad, people in neighbouring countries, with unionists. So all other potential fellow travellers who were interested in social justice. Let's talk to them. Let's talk to them. And so my concern about the issue of, well, we're not going to talk anymore to other people because it is exhausting. And, you know, I've been doing it for 30 years. It is exhausting. And, you know, what I think, Rob, one of the things that is alarming to me is that we're almost having the same conversations that I had in the early 90s. We thought we went through a period, I'm bound to tell you, that when a lot of your students were born, roughly middle of the 90s, end of the 90s, we went through this period where we thought, there's a Labour government. Shortly, 10 years later, and you know, I found this when I had sabbatical at Harvard. People were telling me this is a post-racial America. Not only have we elected a black man, we've re-elected a black man with a Muslim-sounding name or something. With this, you know, it's all hunky-dory now. We are having the same conversations, and one of my friends, Elif Shafak, the brilliant Turkish writer, feminist writer, what Elif says is, think about this notion of a linear concept of history. She also says, think about the circularity of history, how history can regress. And I do feel that there has been a regression, and we're having the same kind of fights that we had and we thought we'd won in the 90s. But, you know, the thing about it is we won them in the 90s, and I think we can win them again. And I think you'll see, for example, next week when he says confidently Trump loses, that, you know, there is a bit of a pushback. And, you know, it's just this sort of social physics that there is action and reaction. And what we've got to do, I think, is try to understand those concepts and harness them and try to amplify and multiply them. And one of the things is for us to have a clear vision of what we say. Two things are our theory of human behavior and our theory of human change. Theory of historical change. If we've got a clear idea of those two concepts, then I think something like decolonization is incredibly important, because if it's right that a lot of our behavior, and I was based in part at the department as well as the law school, but at the Department of Psychology at Harvard, because I wanted to understand these drivers of human nature. My book is basically about that, about the psychology of all these things. If we understand that, in fact, most of our behavior, most of our thoughts, most of our moral evaluations, most of our decisions are not rational but emotional, and they're driven by emotions, and emotions that basically come from socially constructed and circulated narratives, actually being able individually to contest and start to dismantle those narratives in ourselves is an incredibly important first step.
Thank you very much, Dexter and Rob. We've got 4 more questions, so thank you very much, Emeka, for waiting patiently. Would you like to come in? And if I ask Ruby also to ask her question after Emeka, and we can take 2 questions at a time, because we have limited time now. Yes, Emeka.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this was answered before, but I was just wondering, how do we, as students or even regular citizens, hold people in positions of power responsible for their racial remarks or actions towards us?
Mm-hmm. And Ruby.
Hello. This is a question for both speakers. Do classifications have to imply hierarchies? I know Rob responded to Dexter's point on this a little, but I thought there might be some more discussion around that. If race is useful as a form of identification in terms of forming identities and perhaps analyzing and exposing inequalities, how do we use the situation? How do we manage with what we have?
Rob, do you want to go first?
Yeah. So firstly, how do we hold people to account? I think we have to use the democracies that we live in better, and there are yeah. I suppose I spent years going back to people saying, "You said this. Well, you know, what's happened?" Unless somebody does that, people often will forget what they said. I said in the most charitable way, and I think what Rennie was writing in her work about no longer speaking to white people about race was a provocation rather than a strategy, but it also got people's attention, right? Because they felt, actually, I can not be accountable to you. I can have this conversation with you, and then pretend that I didn't have it and go and have it with somebody else. And one of the really good things that I'm seeing out of the new, younger led Black Lives Matter movement in the UK that I've been speaking with is that they've reached out to speak to the generation before. They've also learned from some of our mistakes. So I'm more hopeful than others might be. And then Ruby, I think we value difference, but we also value what Ziggy Bauman talks about as a liquid modernity. This kind of notion that identity should be it should be an opportunity rather than a constraint. And so what it could mean in terms of different kinds of thinking coming together to create the new is exciting, rather than talking about it constantly as a conflict of people moving in to take over a static idea of a place. And the more people start to see the world in that way, the more hope there is that we actually can get to a stage where we start to value each other and have connections with each other as people, with histories. And rather than trying to suggest that there is some kind of Enlightenment vision of this deracinated kind of thing that hasn't got a connection to the rest of the world. And it's a classic of Black History Month to try and have us all as individuals rather than as parts of movements, parts of connected to people. And I think that is a failure to see the world as it is, and an attempt to try and simplify it down to individuals. Anyway,
Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. So first question, how do we hold people to account? Courage. And for me, the most important quality, I'm often asked this by students I'm helping with their applications, etc. For me, the most important single quality for a lawyer, but particularly a human rights lawyer, because you spend your time, as I have, basically representing the individual against the state. And the state is a massively powerful Goliath. The most important quality you can have is moral courage. That's what it takes. That's what it takes. And there's that sense, what Washington spoke about as this celestial spark in you, this what's called a conscience. We've got it somehow, and we know it. We know when it's triggered. Act on it. Have courage. Have courage. That's what I would say. That's the most important quality for a lawyer, I think. Ruby's question. Well, okay, so there are two parts to the answer to your question, Ruby. First part, you ask, is classification inevitably going to lead to hierarchy? Brilliant question. Okay, there are shelves of books in Harvard Widener Library which will tell you about that. Here is the simple, quick answer. It's a question of social psychology, and it's because one of the things that human beings have as being social animals is, and that was a survival adaptation when we were, we emerged recently from the rainforests of Central Africa into the savannas of East Africa. That's where we all come from. We're all just Africans, obviously. But what we had to develop was a different strategy. And the strategy we developed for survival was to club together into groups, complex social groups. The complexity of social groups, in order for group survival, was that we are incredibly groupish people. We will form groups at a drop of a hat. And experimentation they've done at Harvard and at Bristol and at places around the world, people will form groups and think they're salient and important groups if they go in one door as opposed to another door, if they wear one colour t-shirt as opposed to another colour t-shirt, which you arbitrarily give them. And it's because of this evolved behaviour. Whether they like Kandinsky or Klee, two expressionist painters, I mean, ridiculous groups. Oh God, I'm not going to give as much money to the Klee fanatics. Ridiculous. And so the reason for that is that our evolved psychology leads to two things. One, and this is the stronger force actually, in-group preference and affiliation. The flip side of that coin, which is out-group indifference or hostility, is in fact the exception. A lot of the discrimination isn't actually directly, I don't like this other group. Most of it is actually, I prefer my group. And if my group is being threatened, then that's what happens, rather than just, I don't like that group and I'm going to go and attack them. That's human evolutionary history. Second part of that answer to that question is this, and it goes back to the first point that Rob made right at the start. Really important point. The question of identity and people deriving social comfort, social status, social self-esteem from identity. Absolutely. At the heart of most social psychology is the quest for identity and sense of self and esteem. But what I would say is we need to draw a sharp distinction. And the sharp distinction, Rob, I would argue, is between, I don't think race is an identity that is a healthy one. I think it's pathological because it's based on a lie. And I think that what we really need to talk about, which is what I believe you to be talking about, is shared ancestry, shared culture, shared traditions, shared history, absolutely. But where I think it goes wrong is if people say, oh, because I'm part of this race. We're not. There is no such thing. And to say that we are part of something that doesn't exist, I think is dangerous, and that's what we should challenge. But I agree with Rob. Everything else apart from that, it's all incredibly important in terms of our identity. But race doesn't exist.
Thank you, Rob, and Dexter, both of you. We have got a number of questions in very limited time now, but let me read out a question to you because it was posed a little while ago, and that's by Ariba Iqbal. What practical steps can the law take to overcome the problems in the criminal justice system, and what practical steps can we take as citizens and students? Now, obviously, we can have another symposium on that question. So very briefly, if I may ask you to comment on that question, maybe direct Ariba to some ideas, and then we can get back to our two other questions that we have from Claudia and Haditha, and then we will bring to the session to an end. That's okay.
Rob?
One thing you can do. equality impact assessments. All our public authorities have a duty. In theory, I'm not sure anyone has asked for an equality impact assessment or read one without being in anger for a long time. So maybe just ask some institutions that you're around to see an equality impact assessment for a policy, because I think that will at least give you a hook and a way into having a conversation about race in the public, with a public authority. I'll leave it.
All right, one thing, one thing I think you could do: become a lawyer, become a human rights lawyer. Come and work with me in the front line at the coalface of justice and see exactly what needs to be done. And you know, there is a succession of generations, and our generation, yeah, we are exhausted. We've been fighting it for 25, 30 years. We need new human rights lawyers to pass the torch on to. So train yourself, read and think. The most important of those is to think about what's happening and conceptualize what in fact the system is and what's wrong about it, and then talk further.
Thank you both. Claudia, would you like to ask your question now? And then I'll take Hadika's question and we'll invite the speakers to respond.
Yes, hello. My question would be that many times I feel like an aspect of racism would be people's ignorance and prejudice towards other cultures rather than physical characteristics. So my question would be, how can we, and is it even possible to have a more cultural relativist approach to law on a national level?
Okay. Are we going to deal with this 2 questions or one?
Yeah, well, Hadika, do you want to ask your question now? And then both Dexter and Rob can respond to both of you.
Hi, my question is basically, what are your comments on the diversity of the current justices of the UK Supreme Court?
Okay.
A tall order again.
Okay.
But you can try.
Rob, want to go first?
So let's start with the Supreme Court. Diversity is an interesting one. I think Angela Davis again refers to diversity as sometimes difference without difference. What are we talking about when we talk about diversity? Is it really about diversity of experience? Can they all come from the same 2 universities? If we're thinking about a diversity of approach, a diversity of thought, I wonder whether our current system in the UK will ever is set up to deliver that. But you'll have a better sense of that than I will. Well, the other question, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I've got an answer for.
Okay. I'll take the second question first again, like Rob did, about, was it about the UK Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court?
About the UK Supreme Court.
UK Supreme Court. Well, look, things change. When I started at the bar, there was someone called Margaret Thatcher, who was Prime Minister. At that time, a husband could not rape his wife in law. That's the kind of environment that I started practicing in. So in many ways, there's been a radical transformation. What there hasn't been a transformation, and so in terms of certain rights, absolutely a transformation. The way we treat victims and complainants is much better than it used to be, absolutely. But, you know, we've had a woman who was president of the Supreme Court. That would have been unimaginable when I started at the bar. But there is a massive way to go. And I think Baroness Hales accepts that as well. And she's been a great advocate for that. And I know the previous president, Lord Newberger, David Newberger, who I happen to know personally as well, a decent person. But the difficulty they point to is that these decisions to appoint people right at the top of the tree depend upon a long set of social watersheds and bottlenecks. And I know that, for example, Cambridge has had real difficulty trying to change the ethnicity profile of its intake, and in part because minority ethnic students self-select and think Cambridge isn't a place for me. It's reassuring that this year there are 3 times more black people as undergraduates at Cambridge than previous year, but massive way to go. On this, very quickly, on the second, the real very interesting question, the second question about cultural relativism. We need to be really careful about that. One of the reasons I say that is part of the human rights work I've done in the last few years is to write a report to the United Kingdom Parliament looking at FGM and the safeguarding or lack of safeguarding in the United Kingdom for FGM. One of the arguments in our research trying to write this human rights report, one of the things that kept coming up was that healthcare professionals in dealing with affected communities in the United Kingdom, very often they wouldn't intervene because they were concerned about being perceived as racist. They were concerned that FGM was a cultural tradition, and shouldn't there be a degree of cultural tolerance and relativism? And the message that we tried to convey and enshrine in law is that we must respect culture, but not all cultural practices. If there are traditional practices that are harmful, in this case, genitally cutting children, young girls, no cultural tradition can justify that. It's a fundamental abuse of human rights, it's child abuse, and it's a criminal offence. So I think there are limits to cultural relativism.
Thank you very much, both. We have a question in the chat, and that is to do with, that's from Martha, and she's asking, how do we protect and prepare our young children from racism? I'm thinking of the case of the 5-year-old kindergarten girl in the US who was arrested for having a tantrum. And then she's also, giving another example of, not example, rather raising a concern that is also happening in schools in the UK. So yeah, so that's question, but I'm aware that it's Friday evening and everybody needs to obviously attend to their families as well. So just this last question, and perhaps then we can bring it to the close.
It's quite a nice place to close actually. I think the second comment is mine, so I've responded to Martha.
All right.
And I said schools. Yeah, sure. Schools are part of our society, and so racism happens there too. But it's quite nice to finish with a bit of James Baldwin. He says that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed without being faced. And so I think we have to be honest and own up and tackle things when we see them.
Yeah, and I would just say, okay, I can't trump Baldwin, but I can match him with what Martin Luther King said, that, look, when should we do all this? And Martin Luther King taught us that the time is always right to do the right thing. That in terms of racial oppression and discrimination, the time's been right for about 400 years. We need to keep working, and I believe we can do it together. We can make a massive difference, and I do believe that we have a duty, not necessarily to educate white people. We have a duty to the next generation to do what we can to say there's a line in the sand, and we will do what we can to change it.
Thank you very much. This was wonderful. This was really, really amazing. And I'm sure our students and other colleagues who've joined us today, are feeling the same way as I am. what I'm taking from today is that, as Dexter, you said, that race is a technology of dehumanization. But even, and what Rob, you were saying, that, there are histories and stories to be told of that dehumanization. They create and construct identities, and solidarities are built around that. So I think that's something that we must take away. Well, I'm taking away from this talk, but also brilliant questions from our students as well. Thank you very much. I also would like to thank you, all the organizers from Warwick Law School, Kent Law School, and Exeter, University of Exeter, and it's just amazing. Thank you very much again. Hope everybody has a good evening and a wonderful weekend, and plenty for us to think and reflect. But don't forget to visit our webpage on Warwick Law School's website. There is a reading list for all of you to consider in your own time. Yeah, and also, if you have any other comments, you can always email us as the organizers. And thank you again, Rob and Dexter. Thank you.
Or contact me on Twitter at Dexter Dias QC. If you've got another question, you want to continue the conversation. This all started by me jumping into a conversation between two academics on Twitter. Let's keep doing it. I'm happy to keep talking, because that's how we're going to change that. We're going to change it by keeping talking to each other and to other people.
And also for our students, don't forget to check out Blackout UK.com that Rob is initiating as a media network. So do check that out. Thank you very much again, both of you.
Well, Arjuman, thank you for so expertly convening it and for indulging us and not being too harsh with us. And Rob, it's been such a pleasure to meet. We haven't met before. I don't know how, but we need to keep talking.
Absolutely, agreed. Thanks everyone.
I'll be in touch. All right.
I'd like to give a round of applause, because we don't get this very often in the online space. Thank you.
Good stuff.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.
Yeah, have a great one. Really appreciate it. Thanks to everybody.
Thank you.
Speak
Bye.
soon. Cheers. Bye-bye.